Okay. Hello, I'm Chinenye Ozowalu, and I'm here with Keisha Scarville. I'm doing an interview for the Alumni Photo Gallery, which I'm the undergraduate curator for. It'll be opening next fall, and I'm doing this on behalf of the RIT Archives. So the first question is, can you please introduce yourself with your name, the year you graduated from RIT, and what programs you studied?
Um, my name is Keisha Scarville. I graduated from RIT. I want to say it was either 97 or 98. Um, it's so long ago, but I actually studied or concentrated in biomedical photography.
And why biomedical photography?
Well, I don't know if I have a quick answer for that. Um, I actually came to RIT. I came to RIT actually initially studying business. That was the initial program that I applied to and got accepted. But all throughout high school, I was in love with photography. Like that was all I wanted to do. But when it came time to apply for college, one of my mother's closest friend, who's kind of like my godmother, she expressed to me that she didn't see photography as being a viable option for a career and that I wouldn't make any money. She was like, why don't you choose something safe? Like, she's like, what about accounting or marketing? Like, those are like real safe careers where you will always have a job. And so I listened to her. And I knew RIT was had a photo program. I think I wasn't as aware until I got there, like how good the photo program was. And so I got to RIT and with this like, with this focus on business and I was miserable. I was really miserable. I hated my classes. And I remember one of my professors in the business program, um, bless her, she came up to me one day after class and she was like, can I ask you something? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, what do you really want to do? And and I remember I was like confused. I'm like, why is she asking me this? And she's like, just tell me. She's like, what do you really want to do? And I was like, I really want to do photography. And she was like, okay, well, what I want you to do is she's like, I want you to walk out of this building. She's like, walk over to the arts and science building. She's like, walk over there. And she's like, and transfer. She's like, walk over there, see what it's like. She's like, and transfer your major. She's like, because if you stay in this program, she's like, you're gonna drop out. She's like, I can see that you're unhappy. She's like, I can see you don't have any passion for this. And so I did. Like I literally left and I went over and I remember walking around the building and I remember even smelling, I was walking past the dark rooms and I could smell the chemicals from the dark room. And I was like, I got to do this. I have to change my major. And, but I didn't know, I didn't know, or maybe I did know, but I didn't know you had to like choose something within photography. And I think biomedical just kind of, it was something I had never heard of. I was just really fascinated by it. Um, like there were these like possibilities of like ways in which we were kind of looking deeper into like the bodily experience through photography that really fascinated me. And I think I've always been interested in biology on some level. So I was just really curious and fascinated by like what the possibilities. of learning and understanding the depths of what photography could offer on that level that I was interested in. But once I got into the program, I immediately took classes in all the other departments. Um, so I really stretched my class load every quarter was like insane because I was doing all of my requirements for my biomedical degree, but I was also really interested in like editorial and fashion and like lighting and it was just all of these things and just being in those crit spaces and having these kind of like the multitude of conversations was just something I was really into.
I feel like for me, like maybe this story is insane because I had a class, it was drawing one, with Professor Clifford one. He's a very strict professor. It was a very difficult class. Um, but I just remember I was industrial design when I came to school. Same kind of idea where when I told everyone like what I was going to study, um, they just didn't understand why I would want to do something art related. Like my
Mm,
parents are both trained in economics and finance back home and then came here and did sciences and like I've always naturally been focused into science. Like it was very easy for me. So I have a photographic memory, so like passing those classes were really easy for me.
mhm,
So people just did not understand and I was like, okay, what can I do instead? And I was taking an engineering track in high school. Um, partnered with RIT through Project Lead the Way. And I got halfway through with those like college level classes and I was very unhappy. So I switched my track then to art. Um, but then I still compromised like what I really wanted and chose industrial design because I thought it was a good medium where like I could make product and then be secured a job because I'm in like production. Like I'm within capitalism. I was like, okay, like this is something that we need products every day. I will be in demand.
mhm,
It wasn't really like what I saw myself doing that made me completely happy, but I didn't understand that at the time. And in this drawing class, I told the professor my major multiple times, and Mr. One was like you're in industrial design, and I was like, yeah. And then he was like, are you sure you're industrial design, or like are you not like in any kind of fine art or something like that? I think he was trying to recruit me honestly into painting, but I I think like from that moment, like when he was telling me reasons why he felt as if I should rethink my decision. And I kind of pushed it off until the second semester where I was taking more ID classes, and it all felt really baseless to me. And I don't mean it's baseless as like a profession because everyone, like people I know really love it and like they're really good at it. And I could see like in my drawings, like it's something that I am good at because I think drawing is a skill I have and like thinking, like forethought, but it wasn't anything I had a zeal for. And I could tell like in my sketches versus other people's, like it was not the same. Like I wasn't going above and beyond. Um, and I just spent a lot of my time in photography books in the library. And I was like, I'm not looking into industrial design at all. I'm interested in something else. And it was like a class by McFadden called Race, Civil Rights, and Photography that I took by surprise. I wasn't really planning to take it, but I needed an ethical perspective.
mhm,
Um, and that class changed my life. Like I sat in that class and I was like, I couldn't like explain why I was so, because I never had thought of photography. Like I never had thought of like if I was going to do an art form, it being photography. But I sat in that class and he was talking about like the power of the image and the story of Emmett Till and also showed us through a lens darkly. And I was just like, this is a whole canon of like Black representation and expression that I have never seen before.
mhm,
Um, and like in that like class, I told him like I'm gonna change my major, and he was like, okay, like we'll see. And then I didn't tell my parents. And I I didn't tell my parents and I changed my major with almost a full year done. Um, so I think like that experience is like so like I feel very seen in that where it's like a lot of people I think in the program like they came for this program. They like saw it and they're like, okay, this is a program that's top ranked. It has all this gear. Like I did not know anything about gear,
Right,
nothing about the faculty, and
right.
kind of just came because it found me here. And
Mm-hmm.
like that class for me was like a pivotal class.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like wonder, like for you, with all the different classes you were taking, what was a pivotal class for you? Like what was a class that like was one of your favorites?
Oh my gosh. At RIT, it actually wasn't a photo class. Actually, there were a couple. The one that rises to the top, like almost immediately, was there was a class being offered in the film department called Race and the Movies, by gosh, I think professor's name was Pacho Lane. I don't know if he's with us anymore, but at the time, at the time there were a handful of us. I don't know what the demographic is at RIT now, but um, all of the students of color throughout all of the art knew each other. We knew each other, I think I think in my year was me and a another young woman, Melissa Barnwell, who were both Black women, who are both Black women. And two other friends of mine were in the film department, Black men. Again, like a friend of mine was studying painting, and she was one of a few, Black women in that department. Another friend was studying textiles. She was one, I think she was the only. So we all knew each other. We all had this kind of like network where we supported each other. And any classes that would come up or courses that would come up that would kind of engage the Black experience particularly, we would like tell each other like, okay, this is class is coming up, we should take it. So this class, came up like race in the movies, and my two friends, Glenn and Jason, who were in the film department, they're like, this class, like we got to take this class. And so we all signed up. I think there was like six of us who like signed up for this class. And essentially like every week, and Pacho was such an interesting and like just passionate professor, and really like was willing to have like the hard conversations. So every week we would watch two films, either historical or contemporary, and we would just have a conversation about it. We would watch them and then have like just the whole class would talk about it, talk about, what were some things that we were responding to, what were some things that we noticed in terms of like race relations. And Pacho would always kind of give us like historical context, and we were also reading a lot of like film theory, and a lot of bell hooks. Like he was assigning us bell hooks, and this was like late 90s. And so we still talk about it to this day. Like, because I keep in touch with everyone. We'll still talk about it to this day where we would talk about like, oh, did you see this film? And did you notice this, and this? And someone would be like, damn, like that Pacho Lane class like really opened our eyes. So it was one of the most impactful classes in terms of really kind of digging into visual culture, and for us like the Black experience, and like ways in which Black bodies were being portrayed. And so it was a like no one pulled punches in that class. We often got into heated discussions and heated debates. um but it was, and even amongst ourselves, like, we would have conversations even around gender, that became heated. So it was one of those classes where it just had these kind of lasting impact because like after that, I never saw things the same. Like it was like, when your eyes are like really like open and you just see everything differently and deeper. So that was a really impactful class for me. I loved that class. And we were also asked, like after the debate, like after class was over, we would all have to like write. We would have to kind of do like essentially like a journal writing, where we would just write about like what were our thoughts, like what were things that came up for us, and we would submit it every week. And at the beginning of the following class, Pacho would anonymously read some of people's journal entries without saying who said what. Um, but it was just this really amazing space of just like sharing out and just like really kind of getting into the deep of it. So great class. Um, oh gosh, I think in terms of photography, you know, there's a professor, Dennis Deffenbaugh, who does have a special place in my heart. Um, he does. Um, because I think all of his classes, I think he taught an editorial class. And I'm blanking on the exact names of all the courses, but I think I took most of his courses. Um, and I think like his courses, like Dennis was always really great at like bringing in these like contemporary conversations around photography. Um, at the time, most of my experience in the photo department, we would talk about like the history of it, and we would talk about expression and like what we wanted to kind of discuss. I think Dennis was one of the first professors that um, he would, he's like, okay, we have the history, but like, what are the conversations happening right now? Like what's going on, like what is the pulse of what's happening right now? And so I really appreciated him for that. And I remember, I think they still do this, I don't know, but I remember he had this course every spring where we would take like a week-long trip to New York. um and we would meet, he would set up all these meetings and we would meet with all these different people in the industry, and that was just, it was just really amazing, because we would all have our portfolios and would meet with like editors and photographers and like all these, and they would like actively meet with us and give us feedback on our work. And it was one of those classes where I was like, okay, um, now I'm kind of understanding like how all of this works and like how am I seeing myself in all of this. So I would say those are the two courses that I think were the most impactful for me.
I think that we should close this Zoom and open it up again because the time is going out. Um,
Oh, okay. Do you do you want me to use mine? Because I don't have a how long is this supposed to be?
I have a few more questions. There's not really a time cap in terms of how long it should be. It depends on how much time you have.
Mhm.
Um,
I
so
mean, I can use my account because I don't have a time limit on my account.
yeah, that's perfect because I'd even realize this would happen. So,
No worries, no worries. I'll create one and I'll send it to you.
okay.
I'll see you in a bit.
Hey, hello. We are continuing the oral history interview between artist Keisha Scarville and myself, Chinenye Ozowalu. the undergraduate curator of the RIT Photography Alumni Gallery on the 31st of January 2025. Um, so the question I'm going to ask is, when and where were you born?
When?
Yeah.
Oh, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in November 1975.
Well, and I have a question about overall RIT, because I know they don't have it anymore, but do you recall of a program called Gallery R? No? Okay.
The program was called Gallery R, like the letter R.
Yeah, it was like a student-run gallery.
No.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Um, so we discovered per previous talking that we have a purchase prize of yours from 1997. I'm going to share this image. Let's see, how do I do this? It's
Oh, oh, wow. Yeah.
yeah, I like saw it and I was like, wow. Like this is like so different.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Like there's a lot that I feel like might be the same. And I was gonna ask like, how did this come about? How do you feel about it now? Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I think wow, I was going through like a soft focus printing phase. Oh my gosh, this is bringing back a lot of memories. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to remember. Um, I was taking I think I was taking a fashion class. Like there was a professor. Well, did I do this for that class? I can't remember it, I'll be honest. Um, there was a course that was being offered. I think it was like a visiting professor was teaching like a fashion class. And I had never like I would not I wasn't interested in fashion per se, but I was just like, oh, let me just see what this is about. Um and it was just kind of like these like different ways of kind of thinking about like clothes as expression. It was an interesting course. But I don't know, I think I was more interested in like ways in which like clothes can become statements, or just like ways in which like the clothing itself can present questions. Um, and I think at the time, like I was doing a lot of experimentation with like different formats. I remember I really loved photographing, like Pentax 6.7 was my camera. Um, and I asked a friend of mine who I often photographed. My friend Jariatu, who's in this picture. She was, in a lot of ways, she was like my muse. I love photographing her, and she was so willing to be photographed. She was actually studying to become a interpreter for the hearing impaired at the time. Um, and so, we set up this time. I was like, I want to photograph you. And I had some ideas, but didn't really know until I got there. And like, I was like, I know I want the hanger. Like, I just wanted everything to have like some type of symbolism behind it. I know I want the hanger to be clear. I didn't want it to have any kind of like visual like weight to it. Um, and I was like, and I want you to wear the clothes, but I also want to photograph the clothes as them like by themselves and just have them as being like just as objects. And so, yeah. And again, like I'm trying to remember my thought process behind, because it was a long time ago. And I just remember we were just like experimenting, and there was just something about like the white shirt against like the white wall, and the black tank top against the white wall, and then just photographing her with the hanger above her. that, at the time I was just like, yeah, this is it. Like this is the image. And I think initially this was the image that I wanted to show, but it just felt incomplete without showing like the pieces of clothing on opposite ends. Um, so I don't know, like there was just a lot going on at the time where I was very adamant and very conscious of um, wanting to create images of Black people, wanting like really wanting all the images I took were exclusively of people that look like me. Um, but also the dynamics, like there was just like all of these different dynamics going on in terms of like how images were how images of us were being portrayed and how they were being perceived. And even in that class, that fashion class was really rough in terms of thinking about fashion and thinking about Blackness. And so for me, it was just not necessarily thinking about like fashion and identity and culture, which, was, things that, a lot of folks were doing. I don't know. I think I wanted to kind of think of them as like think about clothing as symbols. Um, and that was as much as I can remember from that time. But yeah, yeah.
Do you think there's like parallels between your work now and the work then?
Um, hmm. I mean, I think it's all part of one long trajectory, it's all part of one long history. I think the things that were at the foreground of my thinking in my mind at that particular time is not so much as what I'm thinking about now, in terms of image making. Um, I think that there's always going to be a focus on um, the Black experience. I think there's always going to be a focus on that. Um, but I think I was catering to or kind of thinking about catering to things that I'm not as interested in anymore. I think I was kind of in that time, just um, wanting to be, like wanting my work to be accepted, wanting the work to fit in, or wanting it to kind of be on par with who I was being taught about as being like the thing we should all the images or the photographers or the work that my work had to aspire to. Uh,
Mhm.
that was definitely something that um, was something I was thinking about a lot then that I don't necessarily think about as much now. So, you know,
I feel like that, like the wrestle between like what you are interested in and like what you think you should be is like something I am like in now, where it's kind of like I see work and I'm like, wow, like I love that person's work. But then like I forget that they had their own journey to get there and that like my journey is not like the goal of my journey is not to try to undercut what it could be by trying to be them. I feel like everyone needs the time and they owe it to themselves to give themselves time to figure it out.
you know,
So I just feel like when you said about like trying to like make work and like so I think there's a lot about learning that comes from like emulation and that's how a lot of photography is taught like through emulation. Um so I just like really agreed with what you said. I like wanted to tell you. Um but I just feel like it's so hard to break away from emulating another person. And it's like also hard because images are there's just so many of them where it kind of feels like, is yours really different? like there's this like theory of like collective consciousness and like that I like people are tapping into ideas. Like there's an idea floating around that it's
Yeah,
like it's open to everyone. And it's like, yeah, like I have this idea. What is the
yeah,
ownership of an idea? And it's like I tap into this idea and then like, oh, like maybe like tomorrow someone else also is tapping into the idea. Like I feel like that kind of network is interesting that we have as humanity, but also like it's kind of worrying in a industry where, especially like in art in general, like the canon where like it's really based on like uniqueness. Like you pick a niche or you have a medium and you work in that and like there's this whole line of pedagogy that comes with that medium and how the medium has progressed and like it's studied in a very linear way and
yeah,
tends to be taught in a very linear way.
yeah,
And like it's made me think about why why should I pick photography as a medium in
mm,
general, where it's like in art history, photography has come later. So that's something that I find interesting where like the canon's still very young and I really think
mm,
that's interesting. But also in a way, because of like the technology behind it and the way that like it's always like quasi-referential to something else. Like it's whether it's representational or not, you are using something from real life to create that image. Like it's not like from your hand expressed out. Like there's something you're using from reality.
mm.
So I guess like my question is, why do you choose photography to be your primary medium outside of like your initial interest? Like what are the mechanics of photography that like are intrinsic to you and like your thought process, you know?
Yeah. I mean, first, I do want to say that I think that I do kind of question like this idea of uniqueness. Like, there's something about it that kind of feels mythical to me. Um, and I think that there's a difference between like uniqueness and authenticity. Um, and like we are kind of all like swimming around in like the same ideas, like they're and there is no, but there at the same time, like there's not a scarcity of ideas either, so and I do question like ways in which folks are taught that um, like making things distinct. It's a lot of pressure, it's a lot of pressure. I think for me, like what is key is not necessarily through the emulation and replication, but more specifically through the conversation. Like I love when, like the question um is like there's the question of like, who inspires you? But I also love the question of like how are you in conversation with? Like what is the work that you feel that you're in conversation with? And I think that makes it more less of this thing of like emulation and more of like the dialogue, the exchange, like what of someone else's work inspires me and how does that metabolize in me and then informs the gestures that I make. Um, and so there's that. I think from the first time I picked up a camera, and in high school and like going out into the world, like literally being given a camera and then my high school teacher kind of giving me this charge of like, okay, let's go out and look, like let's go out and look and see and like what is it that you want to capture. Um, which for me, I think is really like the essential, it's like the essential charge of what I love about photography is like, what of what's happening around you do you want to capture and hold on to, um, and interpret? Um, and so for me, I think my love of photography was like, okay, it is this way in which that I can interpret, um, but also investigate and understand, the things that are around me, um, the things that are within me, you know what I mean? So there was something of like the camera being this tool of like saying, yes, like this moment I can hold on to. And now, like, what do I do with that moment? Um, like, what is that? Like, what is this thing of this moment that I want to kind of elongate and hold on to forever, you know? So that is something that I think has kept me tethered to photography for such a long period of time. And I think I don't know, like I don't get too caught up in a conversation of like everything's been photographed, everything's been done. Um, and for me, it's like, yeah, okay. And you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that that should lead to like, it doesn't bring me to a place of exhaustion, meaning like, I don't feel exhausted by looking at something that's been looked at already. Um, and sometimes like there are things that are happening that I'm seeing or experiencing that like really hold on, like I really want to hold on to that. And then there's images that I haven't taken. There's images like that are kind of part of my experience and part of my like visual ecosystem. There is something of like the images that I've taken and the images that are kind of part of the ecosystem that creates this like beautiful, wondrous web for me. So while I do understand that, the conversations around photography being dead or um like all the possibility, like, when folks say like all the possibilities have been explored and like there's nothing else unique to say. I just really strongly disagree with that. I mean, it's almost like saying that we've used all of the words already, so why say it again? Um, I mean, there's things that still need to be said, you know. That's just how I feel.
That was very helpful for me personally because yeah, I think that's something like the whole imposter syndrome that I kind of like think of. Which I guess is like natural for like if you're kind of trying to figure yourself out. I think when you have a practice and something that like you intrinsically are kind of trying to like you are letting yourself explore. I think it's more of like me just needing to be open to myself and like what I want to say and like how I naturally want to say it than thinking about the reception of the work. So yeah.
It's not easy. It's not easy. And it is a completely, it's a completely different landscape, and the landscape is changing rapidly. When I was this like, when I was a student in undergrad to, what I see happening with my students now. Um, and yeah, like I do question. I'm not, I'm not completely absent from what is happening. Like I do question, like, what is the future of photography and what does that look like? Is there a future with photography in it? Um, those are definitely things that I'm thinking about and contemplating. Um, but you know, I still, and I kind of, I'm like, am I hanging on to something that maybe I should let go of? But I don't think so. Like there's still so much. And I think what's hurting photography, um, I think what's hurting photography is this kind of like the aim or kind of using it as a popularity contest. I think sometimes hurts photography. Um I think everybody is in a space of scarcity, and if your images don't garner a general amount of attention, then it kind of takes on this kind of worthlessness. Um, and that's something that I think tends to kind of go into a real um, tricky place for photography.
Like with the image, we've talked about like kind of the mechanics of the image, but there's also another component to your work where you're projecting the image outwards, whether like you're reprinting it or rephotographing it or collaging it. Um, and I wanted to ask, like, how is the hand imperative to your work? Like whether it's your hand or photographing the hand. Um,
You mean like photographing hands,
no,
basically?
like as in like how is
Like me.
like manipulating the image? Like how does that funnel into your practice?
Hmm. Um, hmm. I mean, I think I I and I've spoken about like it is very difficult at this juncture in my life. It's very difficult to approach creating an image without thinking about um, all of the images that brought me to that point. So I am, I think I am like now like supremely aware that every time I push that button, there is like all of these images that are kind of part of that. So when, so I think especially in like the last 5, 6 years, um, it's been difficult to kind of see my images on their own without seeing everything that has come with it. And for me, it's like it's the images of my family. It's the images that I absorbed growing up. It's the images that have frightened me. It's the images that have brought me joy. It's all of that that is kind of part of every image that I take. So um, I think I've been really more interested in um, the conversational space that creates versus this is like how I see. And I think I sometimes have difficulty um seeing my images on their own without seeing the images that brought me there. Um, and I think there's something of this space of the singularity of images of photography being of this like this individual's unique way of seeing the world. Um, I have I tend to kind of have a little bit of a pushback on that, where I couldn't make that image without all the other images or all the other things that I'm thinking about. So for me, like all those other things are just as important. So when I create an image and I either sit down at the computer or I'm sitting um, at my desk, I am interested in like, okay, well, what do these like visually maybe disparate things have in common, or what is that, what is the language that's created when all of these are kind of occupying the same space? And so I think about that. um and I'm more interested, I think, about the language or the language that's created by all of these kind of occupying the same space. And then there's moments where, like I'm actively thinking about like, this kind of image. Like I think about the images that I've been doing about my dad, like, which are these kind of, for me, like feel like such blank canvases. Um, so this like existing passport image of my dad, um, which is so void of all the things, like the lived experiences of my dad. So sometimes like my actual like really like having these like active like gestures and intervention into the image for me is kind of like a way of like um all these experiences and making them visual from this like perceived um very neutral space.
When you speak about the separation of an image and like lived experience, I now question kind of in your in your selection shown at Lim and Higher Pictures, is there something about sculpture where is there something about sculpture where it brings you closer to showing more about lived experience, like in tandem to the photo? Like, what is it about that change in form?
Mhm. I think with the show with Lem, there are a lot of ideas I was like thinking about. I think my own like my own use of textiles and fabric and like working with it in to create the image, which is kind of this like building of space by using that to be photographed. Um, and like the ways in which you can, or the ways in which I'm thinking about kind of like troubling space or kind of troubling how we kind of interpreting space by way of like using fabric as kind of entering, like, like entering a different spatial understanding. Um, but so much about that work was also thinking about thresholds, was also thinking about um, the limbo line within Caribbean culture and my own research and kind of understanding what that limbo dance represented, and what were the precursors of this particular dance and what were the roots of this dance, which had so much to do with Middle Passage, but also had to do with how do we kind of understand our body's passage between different spaces. And so for a long time, I knew that I wanted to kind of have something where I extracted that sculptural element that I'm kind of doing or performing in the image to be photographed and externalize that. And so for that show, I was able to, like, I had my hands fabricated and kind of created this kind of mimic of a limbo line. And a lot of it was kind of thinking about not only the experience of like looking into the photograph, but like what is one's experience moving through that show and, wanting to kind of have that be this other space of contemplation and navigation and maneuvering um, for that show, but also kind of to think about like the ways in which for me, I'm constantly going back and forth between photographing here in the US and photographing in Guyana, South America, which does require, um, contemplating and holding my lived experiences here in America and my lived experience in Guyana, but also the maneuvering it takes to kind of move between those two particular borders or perceived borders. Um, I think with that show, wanting to kind of bring some of that to how one has to move around that space.
And kind of as a follow-up, talking about like thresholds, how has your development between like two binaries of being like neither Guyanese, like born in Guyana, nor like fully like the most basic understanding of American either. Like being between those two worlds. Like
Mhm.
how's that affected how you go about or how like your visuality is, like as in terms of like points of reference. Um,
I mean, I think there's I think for a okay, well, for a long time, for a long time, I remember like, I would tell people like I'm Guyanese.
don't get me twisted, okay?
And my family in Guyana were like, you are not, girl. My parents, they're like, you're not Guyanese. Stop it. Um, But, like there was, and part of it was because like my whole family, is there. Like that's where when I think about like family, like it's not here, it's there. And like since I had two family members pass. So now it's like me, my dad, and like I have a cousin here in America. So, but like my family is the bulk of my family is in Guyana. So, um, so I think like, and also, because, the places where I really kind of like was nested in family was in Guyana, like that since I was a child, like we would make several, just make trips there. And so there was something, I was like, okay, well, my family is there. So I'm Guyanese, but that was like me growing up and just kind of like trying to kind of understand like how I was trying to identify myself and what I was using to kind of nest my identity. I think now I think I've let loose, I've let go of this idea of like claiming and I'm even skeptical of the the idea of trying to claim, like I'm kind of both. I'm neither, but I'm both in between like and like for me, like I represent this kind of slippage of, where we're both kind of like intersect. And so that's just what it is for me. So and so the so it's not necessarily like I am, period. Like it's like I am, like dot 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 dot. And so I think about that in terms of like it affects the way I think it definitely affects like my image making, um, or the visuals that I kind of am drawn to, because I definitely am drawn to like ways in which both places are present and in my work, the ways in which one could be or it could not be in this particular location, um, or the way in which one image may be taken in Guyana kind of leads itself to an image taken here. So um, I kind of think about like each image kind of being their own puzzle pieces in a lot of ways instead of like these statements.
and is this why you have no bodies of work on your website?
Coming at me with that. I didn't. I used to. I like way back in the day, and I think it's part of that thing. It's part of that thing where it's like, okay, well, this is how I have to present myself. And I am, it's like I used to have like everything categorized, and I was just like, you know what? I don't want to do that. I don't want to do it. I don't want to categorize. Like, and I think part of it is that, you know, as I'm kind of developing and continuing to develop, and constantly developing as a photographer, as an image maker, I'm letting go of all the things that are telling me how I'm supposed to present myself. Um, and it is getting increasingly harder to think of my work as different bodies of work, of these distinct bodies of thought, like they are all occupying the same place. And that's okay. I mean, that's what works for me. And I think it brings me back to, and maybe it's like it brings me back to, when I first started doing photography. I just really loved looking and taking images, and just having this collection of images that represented all the things that I loved looking at, or all the things that I wanted to kind of question. So yeah, so I mean, I mean, it's and maybe it's a form of resistance too, but categories become less interesting to me, um, for me personally, or they just become less tenable and for me to kind of hold.
And, like these categories or like lack of them, I think also show up in lick of tongue, rub a finger on soft wound, like especially in the archival imagery where I'm like, is this your familial archive? Is this not your familial archive? And then like you superimpose them on each other. And out of curiosity, I wonder the ones that are not your familial pictures, where are they coming from? They feel like screen grabs. Like I can't.
I mean, hmm. Some of them are screen grabs. So I mean, a lot of them, again, like, I remember the first time, I mean, this may not make sense, but I remember the first time seeing Roxanne Shante rap. And in hip hop, I grew up like when hip hop was like really, it was like a burgeoning thing. My brother um was, like that was his era, and like, and I just remember like he was always listening to like these male rapping voices. And so when I first heard Roxanne Shante, I was just like, wait, a woman? A young one? Like a teenager? Like a teenage girl? Like, ah, it was so, ooh. And I just remember seeing her and I was just like, wow. Like it was just, like it was just this moment, like it was just like these moments that just opened something up for me, where I didn't understand like how impactful it was until many, many years later. And that was something, like in terms of thinking about archive, or thinking about like what an archive can be. Um, and what I find really amazing about archive is like, the ways in which it reveals itself, maybe not so much in the moment, but, in the future. So yeah, so like there's like that, like the first time I saw Cicely Tyson in a movie, I was just like, oh God, like, bleh. And this is like part of like, I hope this isn't the case for young girls anymore, but growing up, I did not see, like, there were no dark skinned girls, like there were just like in visually, like in movies, like in videos, like, like there was a particular look of a Black woman um, that I just didn't see. Um, and so when I saw Cicely Tyson, who was dark skinned, beautiful, had this like natural afro, I was like, oh my, like, yeah. Um, and so like seeing, and also like the roles that she played, like there was like a vulnerability and a strength to her. Um, and my dad, I have to thank my parents, like they were very, they tried their best to make sure that, like visually and also intellectually, that, I was kind of coming up in a very conscious way. So visual culture and images, like what was popular and like what my parents were showing me, like that wasn't popular, that was kind of considered like subculture or counterculture. There was like those two different things happening.
What
Um,
was that like? Like, what is that counterculture? Like, what could it
well,
be?
I mean, I think like my dad, both my dad specifically, um, is Pan-Africanist. Like he like was very much into Marcus Garvey and Marcus Garvey's teachings. Um, he was really into like roots reggae, like Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, who were not necessarily like we're not necessarily like these celebrated, amazing artists. Like they were kind of considered anti-establishment in the beginning. Like, like who the hell are these individuals wearing their hair as locks and talking about freedom and talking about, ways in which we need to kind of push against establishment. Um, and so my dad, would play that music for me and talk to me about that. Um, And when I remember going through this period where I was like, I want to straighten my hair. I want my hair to be um and like skin bleaching was a thing, it was a huge thing. I mean, it still is. And I remember my dad and my mom were just like, nah, like
Like, don't do that.
like these are images you should be like, here, look at these, look at this. Um So so like that was also something, without saying it explicitly in the book, I wanted to show it, like these were the images that were like, those were the images that I was brought up on. And, under, just kind of help to shape who I am.
How do you reconcile with the wall?
With the
Like,
wall.
yeah, like when you show your work, the gallery wall, institutional wall, like how
Ooh,
do you reconcile with the
beautiful
institutional?
question. That's a beautiful question. Um, I don't. I have issues with the wall. Me and the wall got beef. No, I think like I am. Okay, how can I answer this clearly? I think especially starting with Lim, was when I started kind of like, I'm like, oh, maybe everything doesn't need to be this kind of straight line. Like, what if an image is down there? What if an image is up there? Was like one of the first times where I was like thinking about like movement and the wall, or the solidity and the wall. I think especially with these last two shows, the two shows that are open now, um, is when is a place where I'm like actively thinking about like there's the wall, but then there's like things that are kind of suspended. um, so some images, the show I have up at CPW right now, like there's images on the wall, but there's images that I've printed on fabric and are suspended. away from the wall. And so um, wanting to kind of offer folks as a way, like when they enter the gallery space, that, there's kind of these like layers that bring you to the wall. And so that was something that was new for me that is becoming a part of like how I'm thinking about like exhibition spaces. Um, and so the wall is the wall, um, but can we have like ways in which like the wall can now become a collage, or the space now can become a collage, or there are things that are kind of leading us to how we approach it, how we approach the image on the wall. And so it's something I did for CPW, and it's a couple of pieces I have at ICP. Um, um, I have some images like hanging in front alongside images that are on the wall. I'm doing a horrible job describing it, but uh,
Layered, like
yeah,
layered.
yeah, yeah. But I'm not mad. I mean, yeah. Um, they have their function at the same time, like the wall has its function at the same time. In the book, in the book, I started the book, like the book begins and ends with like these studies that I've been doing of the seawall in Guyana. Um, and every time I go to Guyana, I spend pretty much every day at the seawall. Like I literally wake up, and the first thing I do is grab my camera and I walk out to the seawall, and I literally just walk for, I'm just like walking. So I'm at the seawall for hours. Um, and there's something about like, I mean, it's different than the gallery wall, but there is something of like, like the function of the seawall being this thing to kind of protect the land from this kind of growing sea, or this growing water. Um, but there's like so much history in it, but there's like, like it often fails. Um, like there's places in which it's like porous, and so there's something of like the function of this structure and like what it holds, but also like the ways in which it kind of opens up another understanding. And I think about that with the seawall, but as we're sitting here, I'm also thinking about like, are there possibilities of that with um, gallery walls? There's an artist who's in the show at ICP, Camila Janan Rashid. Like she's been doing something really interesting where and we almost did this for the ICP show, but she's been like drilling holes into into the walls and like placing the photograph. And so when you go to see her show, you have to actually look into the hole to actually see her work, which I think is really interesting. Interesting gesture.
To add to that, like off the wall, like I find, for example, like a couple years back, Derek Fajor, which I love Derek Fajor, he had this like he created this kind of like tin room and then had sound within like his imagery, but then also like Fiorella Baez's past show, I don't know if it was at the Whitney or ICA. It was like this huge like
Mm-hmm.
there's like all this fabric, like created like this kind of sensory room and then had the works inside of the room.
Mm-hmm.
And like in both of those, kind of like the thought of bringing the ceiling down or
Mm-hmm.
having like a 4D experience with sound.
Mm-hmm.
In a previous interview that I looked at, you were talking about research for the Passport series, but also Mama's Clothes, where you were interviewing your parents, like with recordings. And I wanted to know if you've ever thought of using that within an exhibition, like those, like the sound of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or overall with work, working with work?
I mean, I think sound has been something that's been I've been slow with. I'm very like I'm very slow with like I'm let's start with saying I'm not really that great with sound, like recording. Like I do my best. And I've been, especially with this work with my dad, I have been considering using some of the recording of him. I think with my mom, I don't know if I would use that. I don't know. I don't know. I'll be honest, I don't know. I think that would be, it'd be really hard for me. I think that'd be really hard for me. And so I think even now, like if I hear like a recording of her voice, oof, it completely destroys me. So I'm slow with that. And I am thinking about it with my dad. I am thinking about it with my dad. But the recordings that I have right now, like the sound isn't great. Um, and I'm still kind of on the fence of like how I would use it. Um, and so it is something that I've been talking to him about, um, but not 100% sure yet. No, but I'm not 100% sure yet about it. Mhm.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, how has curating and teaching added to your practice?
Mm. Teaching, oh, I love teaching. I think, I think what it does and is, like I love being in a space and just like sharing ideas and talking to other artists and others and students. Um, like I enjoy the various perspectives that come up in conversation um, and just kind of seeing like how other people are thinking and like just kind of like what they're doing. I love it. I love it. I think that it helps me to think about, variety of perspectives when thinking about my own work, or it kind of fuels me it definitely does inspire me. A student will say something that will just like, turn my brain. And I love that. And it does help me to kind of think more deeply about my own work. I mean, that's the easiest way of saying it, that that it inspires me. Like my students, and it's very strange. Like I am incredibly inspired by my students. I shouldn't say strange, but um I think there is this, I feel like sometimes like there's this thing of like this like the professor is there to kind of like, pour into and inspire. And I do believe that on some level, but it does go the opposite way. It goes in the other direction. And, that the classroom environment is this kind of community of sharing and thinking and developing inquiry. Um, and so, and it sounds a bit cliche, but it is like I think I see myself as much of as a student, where my students are teaching me and not always the other way around. Um, and it humbles me in that way. So I think that that's the thinking that's happening, or what I kind of glean from it. Um, and does help me to kind of be grounded in the work that I'm making. Um, I think curating is a new, it was, this, doing this curatorial project was really new for me. And I also loved it. I think I was just really blessed with a collaborative experience where I worked with two other established curators who were incredibly giving and understanding and also open to experimentation and really like in the truest sense, like thinking of it as a collaborative experience. I think it opened my eyes to all that goes into putting a show together in a way that I was never really privy to before. Um, and so um, I think it's the collaboration. It's like the thinking through and alongside and with other artists and other thinkers and other curators um, that really helped me to understand the work that I'm making even more. So doing this group show, well, let me just say that I think on both sides, I think, teaching and curating is collaboration. Um, and so I think that it's helped me in my practice kind of think about my work alongside others, but also um, not necessarily thinking like, oh, like it kind of dismantles hierarchies for me. Teaching and teaching and curating has, or in the way in which I've experienced it and understand it, has taken away all those hierarchies and really allowed me to kind of see myself as one amongst many that are doing together. And that helps me be even more grounded in the work that I'm making. Yeah.
And then also, are there any new arenas you are channeling? Any shift you've started recently in your work?
Mm. Um, hmm. I mean, I think, especially with the CPW show, I think, and also I'm going to have this opportunity in the summer to start thinking about installation, like thinking about my work as installation rather than flat images. I think that's been like the newest thing for me. Whereas, um, like there's been like slight inklings, there's been slight inklings, but I think more so now than ever, I've been really kind of wanting to kind of like really kind of dive deeper into that, and it's starting to come out. I mean, it's been hard, like I'm looking forward to having just time to just make and just experiment without deadlines. But I'll be doing a show in France this summer where I'm given the opportunity to kind of like just take a space and like turn it into an installation. And so I'm excited about the possibilities of that.
Is there anything else you want to share?
I don't know, Chi. I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, this is the most I think I've spoken about myself in a long time. Like, I don't usually talk this much about myself. Um, so I don't know if there's more. I really love to quietly make and just put stuff out there. So I don't know if there's much more I can really say.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
Um,
you.
and I'm going to stop the recording now.